Thank you, Chair. Honorable Prime Minister, Honorable Minister of Culture, Youth and Sports, members of the Diplomatic Corps, education officials, the University of Guyana staff, representatives of women's organizations, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, students, a very pleasant good evening to you. I consider it a distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you our guest speaker at this third and final public lecture as part of the 250th anniversary commemorative lecture series organized by the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sports. Ladies and gentlemen, we have at the center of focus today a very distinguished regional and international scholar and historian, Professor Verene Shepherd. Professor Shepherd hails from Hopewell St. Mary in Jamaica. She is the holder of BA and MPhil degrees from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. She became a staff member of the Department of History, herself acknowledged that as a person, she was inspired by prominent pioneer Caribbean historians, including Lucille Maturin Mayer, Sir Hilary Beckles, who was here a few weeks ago, and others, whose contributions helped, and I quote, to rescue Caribbean women from historical obscurity, end of quote. In 2001, Dr. Verene Shepherd was deservedly promoted to Professor of History, becoming only the second female at Mona History Department to accomplish this remarkable feat. In addition to her teaching and research activities, she served as Faculty of Arts representative on Women and Development Studies Group 1989-1991, Faculty Rep on Board for Gender and Development 1996-1998, member of the Mona Campus Strategic Transformation Team 2004-2006, first woman to chair Board of Trustees of Jamaican National Heritage Trust 2006, member of United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, long-serving member and immediate past president of the prestigious Association of Caribbean Historians, ACH, fellow of Cambridge Commonwealth Society, fellow of Dubai Mandela Rodney Fellow, host of Talking History on Jamaica's National Radio 90 FM, director of the Institute for Gender and Development, member of the International Women Forum, member of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, member of the South-South Exchange Program for Research on the History of Development. In addition, she sits on several advisory and editorial boards, including the Caribbean Quarterly, the Guyana Arts Forum, the Jamaican Journal, Slavery and Abolition. She also chaired the Jamaican National Bicentenary Committee on the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 2006-2007. Professor Shepherd has published a number of books, chapters, and articles. She has presented several seminar and conference papers and delivered several public lectures locally in Jamaica, regionally, and internationally. She is the recipient of several awards, including the Jamaican National Heritage Trust Award for her contribution to Jamaican history and heritage, and the Distinguished African Studies Award 2007 from the Florida International University. Among her major publications are Engendering History, Caribbean Women in Historical Perspective, 1991, Emancipation and Immigration, a Pan-Caribbean Overview, 1999, Maharani's Misery, Narrative of a Passage from India to the Caribbean, 2002. I Want to Disturb My Neighbor, 2007. Livestock, Sugar and Slavery, Contested Terrain in Jamaica, 2009. Along with Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, she also co-authored Liberty Lost, Caribbean Indigenous Societies and Slave Systems, 2004, and Freedom Won, Caribbean Emancipation, Ethnicities and Nationhood, 2006. These latter two books are very important texts for history students at the CSEC and Cape levels. She was also instrumental in publishing Lucille Maturin-Smear's path-breaking PhD thesis entitled A Historical Study of Women in Jamaica, 2007. As an advocate of quality public texts, she has worked with CXC and Cambridge GC examination boards. Audience, I present to you one of the region's finest and most distinguished daughters and scholars in Professor Verene Shepherd, to make her presentation, United in Anger, United in War, Gender Anti-Slavery in the Caribbean.
But also because too many of us use sexist lens to view the history of anti-slavery struggle in the Caribbean. Women may not always have been in the vanguard of armed wars, armed revolts, opting for more day-to-day strategies. But such strategies ultimately so undermine the efficiency of the economic aspects of the slave regimes that they played a key role in the abolition of enslavement. But in any case, as my colleague Professor Hilary Beckles asked in his path-breaking book, Centering Woman, what is the political significance of an argument which says that physical combat in war should be privileged above broad-based ideological preparation? Why should non-violent day-to-day strategies be marginalized and men's leadership of armed revolts centered as being more important? And who would dare underestimate the power of the support to the male rebels fighting against General Brady given by women of Clonbrook Plantation in Guyana, who even from prison waved their handkerchiefs, cheered and shouted, "Nigger, make Buckra run today." After all, men and women were united in anger and united in the war against slavery. Admittedly, women have not been given their rightful place alongside the pantheon of male anti-slavery activists we single out for honor each year at Emancipation Day celebrations, during the anniversary of major wars, and certainly during Black History Month. And I wanted to remind you of some of these male activists that we all honor after year. And I don't want to take anything away from them. But while we honor the memory of Kofi, Atta, Jack Gladstone, and Telemarcus of the Berbice and Demerara Wars, Gustav Barbados, Taki, Samshar, Kojo, Kwao, Johnny and Akompong of Jamaica, General Budu and Martin King of the Danish Caribbean, and countless other heroes, very few enslaved women are recognized, and it's not because they didn't exist or their names don't exist. Indeed, most of these women are unknown in Caribbean history. And I want to call their names this evening and ask you, what do you know about Nanny of the Jamaican Maroons, who has been mythologized for her supernatural powers? That's all people say. She caught bullets in her derriere, and that's the popular. What do you know about Susanna of the 1823 Demerara War? About Patty, Anne-Marie, Comba, Nellie, Mary Lee, who endured enslavement on Fort Zealandia? And what about Diana, Lucretia, Jacoba, Susanna, Elizabeth, Lucia, Lena, Cecilia, Christina, Amber, of other plantations in Guyana? How many have heard about Nanny Grigg of Barbados, Cecile Fatima of Haiti, Alida of Suriname, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Jacobs, and Sojourner Truth of the USA, Betta Douglas of St. Kitts Nevis, Filda, Queen, and Abba of Antigua, all recognized as quintessential rebel women who embodied the spirit of Black women's resistance to systems of domination. And every time I hear this song, I say to myself, Bob Marley was talking about these women. I hope my friend has queued up my song. No? Can't find it? Anyway, aha, I hear some songs. Novelist Marlon James's Night Women, in his book of the same name, said, "Enough don't be enough." And I want you to look at some of these names. These are women who participated in the war in Jamaica and were punished brutally for daring to contemplate freedom. And so today we honor Catherine Brown, Catherine Clark, Esther Comba, Anne James, Christina James, and all the women who got so many lashes for daring to contemplate freedom. So you see, women were a fundamental part of the struggle for liberation in the Caribbean. And like men, like these men you see here from the parish of Manchester, paid the ultimate price for their activism. They were united in anger, united in the war against slavery, because the conditions under which Africans were brought to the Caribbean and the slavery they endured were so vexatious to their spirit that they vented their own anger at the injustices of slavery in the fight for liberation. And each time we see the punishment list, I think of Buju Banton and his song.
See them lying their words. Starting on the games. But you know what I sing. You sing. Put this on your shoulder. Kill like today, you cannot kill like tomorrow. You're inside, don't sit alone. How does it feel to take the life of another? Put it on your shoulder. Kill it today, you cannot kill like tomorrow.
The struggles of these men and women demonstrate the historical role of mass political organization in the decolonization process. And we too must be animated by these historical processes. We too must recall that Caribbean societies were created by the activism of enslaved ancestors who confronted their subjugation, said they would not collaborate with it, and laid the psychological foundations for the self-determinist posture of modern whose nationalist luminaries later attacked the imperialist assumptions and impositions. They too were abolitionists, although too many of us employ a traditional definition of abolitionist, centering British intellectuals, parliamentarians, and humanitarians who led the campaign in the United Kingdom after 1783, excluding enslaved women's activism and enslaved men's activism, or separating anti-slavery activism from something they define as the abolitionist movement. Yet in the context of the wider Atlantic, the communities of enslaved men and women were arguably the slave system's fiercest foes. That is why Eric Williams added chapter 12 to his original manuscript, Capitalism and Slavery, ahead of publication, justifying its inclusion on the basis that, and I quote, "It struck me that I had dealt with all aspects of the problem for over 2 centuries, but the people who are the objects and basis of the movement for emancipation, I had left untouched, end of quote. So by focusing on Caribbean women and introducing black resistance into the discourse of abolition, I am recognizing Williams's insistence that there should be no purely humanitarian explanation of abolition, for it was by no means the result of a disinterested action undertaken in the interest of morality. His views have been reinforced by Lucille Mathurin Mayer, that pioneer of Caribbean women's history, whose path-breaking thesis, A Historical Study of Women in Jamaica, now a published book, demonstrated the usefulness and revolutionizing potential of the methodology of women's history, in the process rescuing the female ghost of slavery from an improper burial, to use Jenny Sharp's formulation. Her task was not easy, based on the silences in previous works on Caribbean slavery. In a 1990 semi-autobiographical speech she recounted, "In the early days, I started to seek out the women of Jamaica's past during the period of slavery, women of all classes and of all colors, black, brown, white. I was motivated mainly by intellectual inquisitiveness, the usual ambition of the doctoral candidate to investigate virgin territory, which it was at the time. There was almost nothing to guide such a search. There was in fact nothing in modern historical scholarship about the women who came before me. But this was not surprising, for historiography, which has for centuries been a male academic preserve, has been stunningly devoid of a consciousness of women as significant beings." Now, what Mathurin Mayer found in the pages of history as she tried to decode the mysteries of the black female condition would not only outrage her and make her wonder at what previous historians had ignored, but forced her to become a reluctant feminist, as her life after 1974 demonstrated. By her own admission, wonderful things happened on the journey into that female rebel past, for no one could spend so many years in the company of such women and remain the same. And we all say amen as historians who have excavated this issue. Mayer's and Williams's monumental works of scholarship, added to those of other revisionist historians, represent powerful counter-discourse to the type of knowledge production that marginalized Caribbean women's fundamental role in capital accumulation and the destabilization of this system of slavery. And when we are tempted to ask, where on earth did such women, the so-called subordinate sex, get the nerve to confront systems of domination, we should think of Mayer's answer. It came from their very subordination, the moral force of the powerless confronting the powerful, and from their ability to draw strength from that inheritance of ancestral spirits from that other side of the ocean. And they needed such ancestral spirits to give them courage to fight against the horrifying conditions of enslavement. And their fight started in Africa. We don't know enough about this. And the dominant narrative on this side of the Atlantic Ocean is that Africans collaborated. Not every African collaborated. Popular opposition in Africa took several forms, and I'll give you some examples because it's important for us to know these examples. In December 1727, Koyaba, a woman enslaved at the Royal African Company's fort on Bense Island at Sierra Leone, along with 3 men, escaped from the so-called castle and ran away. They were recaptured 5 months later. But the fact is that they ran. Weeks later, more men and women tried to escape. The rebels were recaptured and punished, but 5 months later, the men and women who worked there, as well as those captured to be sold, joined forces and burnt down the fort. The best-known African woman to struggle against European traders in Africa was Queen Nzinga, who was determined never to accept the Portuguese conquest of her country. The Atlantic voyage continued the violent warfare between captives and their captors. An insurrection reportedly occurred every 8 to 10 journeys. The database compiled on the transatlantic trading Africans by David Eltis and his colleagues contained references to 382 shipboard revolts, 2/3 of which took place at the port of loading or within a week of setting sail. Another example is that in 1714, 3 of the 200 women on the Florida, that's the name of the ship, which embarked captives at Calabar in what we now know as Nigeria and destined for Antigua, who, unlike the men, were unshackled, jumped ship and tried to swim back to Africa. The pregnant one was caught and returned to the ship. The 400 captives from Elmina on the Gold Coast in what we now know as Ghana, and Bonny on the Niger Delta, on board the Marlborough from Bristol, rose up and killed 33 of the 35 crew members in 1752. In 1776, an English captive, Peleg Clark, described how Africans aboard his vessel that had just lifted anchor at Accra rose up, struggled with the crew, and jumped overboard. 28 men and 2 women drowned, but 6 survived. They were recaptured, but they fought. Enslaved Africans continued the struggle in the Americas, engaging in one protracted war to end slavery. This should come as no surprise. Once located in the Americas, women were enslaved in large numbers and subjected to various forms of exploitation and sexploitation, not least those of being categorized as property and unfree laborers and forced to work without wages. This state of unfreedom and commodification provided its self-evident rationale for resistance. The reason for their activism was slavery itself, nothing more, nothing less. Throughout the African Atlantic, the majority of men and women labored in the fields, with women in the Caribbean outnumbering men in the field gangs that did the most arduous work. So when we're going to talk about women having been given lighter work, under slavery, not so. They did the major part of the field work in every gang. Indeed, enslavers came to depend on African women. As Jennifer Morgan in her work, Laboring Women, puts it, they required women's physical labors in order to reap the profits of the colonies, and they required women's symbolic value in order to make sense of racial slavery. Indeed, women served an essential ideological function. Enslavers appropriated their reproductive lives by claiming their children as property to eventually perform unwaged labor. And they used their blackness as justification for making them reproduce the status of enslavement, unlike white women who could only reproduce free status even if black men fathered their children. On sugar plantations, women weeded, planted, harvested, worked in the factories where many lost fingers while feeding cane into the mill, and generally contributed to the productive processes. They labored in enslavers' residences as domestics and nursed the sick in the hot houses. They worked in coffee, cotton, and sugar industries and supplied to the urban areas. Men had a wider range of tasks, as evidenced from plantations like the Romney Estates in St. Kitts indicates, with men distributed over 10 occupations and women only 2. In Guyana, weeding and molding young canes, described as dangerous and tedious tasks, was usually assigned to women, who were expected to go over 1/8 or 1/9 of an acre per day, and females were expected by their managers to gin 30 pounds of cotton. As field laborers and as domestics and concubines, women's bodies became the site of power contestation. Plantation labor placed great physical strains on enslaved women, and any infraction of the slave codes or the law of the black driver was followed by severe beatings and other forms of physical abuse of enslaved women's body. Gracie, of plantation success in Demerara, was locked in the stocks and then sent to work in the task gang because of her alleged affair with Jack Gladstone. Rachel was flogged for taking a sick child to the fields after the estate manager had told her to leave the child with the field nanny. In fact, the history of slavery in Guyana and elsewhere demonstrates that many confrontations between female enslaved Africans and managers arose from contradictions between women's roles as mothers and as workers, which were intensified by growing labor exploitation after the abolition of the trade in enslaved Africans. And Rosie from Grove in Guyana was beaten by the manager because she stopped working as a result of pain she complained of in her belly. The manager ordered her to go and to continue working. He struck her with a small stick and then with a fist, knocking her down. He had her hands tied behind her back and sent her home, where she was put in the stocks for 3 days and 3 nights. And during this time, as further punishment, they kept her away from her child. Jacoba, Julia, Dorothea, Una, Effa, belonging to Le Repentier but working on Le Penitence, complained against the manager when they were unfairly assigned the most difficult task on the plantation, that of carrying megas from the mill. Children were not exempt from the brutality. The most horrifying punishment was that of a 7-year-old girl who had committed acts which Van Guggenheim considered only trifles and childishness, deserving only a child's punishment. However, Gerlach, her manager, had ordered that she be given 250 lashes and placed in the stocks, where she remained without food except what was given her by enslaved people who sympathized with her. And when Van Guggenheim saw her on a visit to her plantation 3 weeks later, her body had been cruelly torn to pieces. He ordered her release to the displeasure of Gerlach. In addition to the abuse of their bodies through physical, arduous field labor, despite severe whipping, enslaved women were open to another form of abuse, what we call sexploitation. For never colonial statutes nor slave codes invested enslaved women with any rights over their bodies, but rather transferred and consolidated such rights within the legal person of the enslavers. Male enslavers thus claimed violent access to enslaved women's bodies, and male and female enslavers to the sale of enslaved women's bodies for money upon the sex market. Novelist Marlon James's Night Women had their usual comment on this, and you really must read this book, the Book of Night Women. This is what his Night Women said. And I hope I don't offend anybody with, it's not my words, the women in the book. It was enough to make a nigger wonder if white men didn't know they were born with cocky until they come to the colony. But Negro get to understand that white men body in bondage in the mother country. And when they come to the West Indies, the cocky be the first thing they set free. As for the white woman, she can only turn her eye and sip tea. End of quote. Thomas Thistlewood, who owned and managed properties in Western Jamaica, and who left daily journals of his activities, is perhaps the most documented example of what today we would call a sexual predator. But he was not alone. In 1824, Robert Wedderburn, a freedman from Jamaica, who eventually emigrated to England, underscored the abuse of enslaved domestic women owned by his Scottish father, James Wedderburn, and this is what he wrote. My father's house was full of female slaves, all objects of his lust, amongst whom he strutted like Solomon in his grand seraglio, or like a bantam cock upon his own dunghill. By him my mother Rosanna was made the object of his brutal lust. The stories of rape also come from Guyana. Da Costa tells us that Betsy was raped by the manager, and Jemet and Susanna had been coerced into sexual relationships. Even children were raped. A case of rape of a 10-year-old enslaved girl by her master has come to light on one of the plantations in Guyana. And as some of you would expect, she later died a few weeks later. Slavery threatened families and parenthood in discrete ways, and women suffered from the separation of families. Sources are replete with evidence of mothers having to see their children sold. Mary Prince, born around 1788, who endured enslavement in Bermuda, Turks Island, and Antigua, left us some idea of how her mother felt. This is what she wrote. It was a sorrowful meeting with my mother. and we lamented with a great and sore crime or unfortunate situation. Here comes one of my poor pickaninnies, she said the moment I came in. One of the poor slave brood who are to be sold tomorrow. The black morning at length came. It came too soon for my poor mother and us. While she was putting on us the new Osnaburgs in which we were to be sold, she said in a sorrowful voice, "See, I am shrouding my poor children. What a task for a mother." And Billy of Clonbrook Plantation told Reverend Smith how unhappy he was at the prospect of seeing Nanny, his wife of 20 years, with whom he had 12 children, sold at a public auction along with some of her children. And this fact should exercise our minds this afternoon. This fact should exercise our minds when we disparage the so-called Haitian boat people. To continue with this matter of marriage, the newspaper advertisements that announced rewards for runaways testify to the frequency of this act of defiance. The 1687 fugitives list for Antigua included Nanny, Joan, Betty, and Sarah. Some stole boats and tried maritime marinage, at times trying to head back to Africa. Maritime marinage became more noted in pure plantation colonies of the Eastern and Northern Caribbean after the frontier disappeared with the Sugar Revolution, as Neville Hall has shown. There were, of course, physical consequences for marinage and resistance to rape, including flogging, further rape, hanging, transportation out of the island, imprisonment, branding with hot irons, guillotine, and dismemberment. Some women were not deterred, though. The possibility of freedom was worth the risk. Let us recall the anti-slavery women, Nanny Grigg of Barbados, who along with Bussa, struggled to end one of the greatest crimes against humanity in Barbados in 1816. We honor Betta Douglas of St. Kitts Nevis again, who in 1825 demonstrated the power of hunger strike while in the stocks. We recall those like Juanica, who were referred to by 18th century writers as female demons, who thwarted the overseers in the field and fomented petticoat rebellion. In 1860, the historian Matthew Gregory Lewis introduced us to Miss Juanica. He said, "Every morning my agent regales me with some fresh instance of insubordination. It seems this morning the women one and all refused to carry away the trash, and that without the slightest pretense. In consequence, the mill was obliged to be stopped. And when the driver on that station insisted on their doing their duty, a little fierce young devil, a Miss Juanica, flew at his throat and endeavored to strangle him. The agent was obliged to be called in, and at length this petticoat rebellion was subdued." The anti-colonial stance of enslaved women, so ably described by Lewis, was echoed by Mrs. A.C. Carmichael, who, writing of enslaved people in Trinidad and Tobago and St. Vincent near the end of slavery, said, "I regret to say that the female Negroes are far more unmanageable than the males. The little girls are far more wicked than the little boys. And I am convinced that were every proprietor to produce a list of his good Negroes, there would be in every instance an amazing majority in favor of males." We recall women who use body language and dress or undress, much as Eugenia Charles would do in the Dominican Parliament later, when she wore the bath suit to protest sexist dress codes, to register their discontent with discriminatory systems and policies. Let us recall the women who joined strikes to negotiate for rights and use economic resistance to carve out an autonomous niche for themselves, even within the confines of slavery. As Barry Gaspar, Dale Tomish, and others have argued, throughout the Americas, enslaved people carved out more livable spaces for themselves by working to transform privileges allowed by the master class into customary rights. They did this through the internal marketing system, and we must honor women for their role in that, and overcoming some of the economic constraints of their lives. Any attempt to remove customary privileges was met with strong resistance. For example, when the legislature of Antigua abolished Sunday markets in March 1831, without allowing substitute time for marketing by law, the enslaved people, among them many women, vented their frustration in a number of ways that scared whites into believing that a general insurrection was in the making. They burned plantations and organized a march to the governor's house. Women attacked plantation management. They petitioned attorneys to get unpopular or particularly harsh overseers dismissed, and they also went on strike to force compliance with their wishes. This under enslavement, imagine now. Strikes were also resorted to when customary allowances such as time to work provision grounds and go to markets were reduced or withheld. The enslaved understood that negotiation for some measure of economic autonomy was not only a way of surviving enslavement, but also of asserting their power as workers on whom the productive activities of the sugar plantation and other properties depended. They refused to be. Let us recall those who resisted rape. The enslaved woman Fibber, Douglas Hall tells us, was no easy conquest for Thomas Thistlewood. It took 2 years of resistance before she eventually had to succumb. Even afterwards, she resisted as much as she could. On several occasions, she refused to sleep with Thistlewood, preferring to sleep out in the cook room or in the hammock in the hall. At times, she did not even speak to him. On the 2nd of February, 1754, Thistlewood wrote, "Fibber did not speak to me all day." On Friday of the same week, he wrote, "Fibber denied me." As time went on and the relationship matured, she complained of his infidelity and withheld her affections periodically. So even though this quote-unquote relationship with Thistlewood lasted over 3 decades, she tried to maintain some autonomy over these years. On another occasion, other women. In May 1756, Mr. Cope of a plantation in western Jamaica summoned 2 women, Susanna and Verene, to satisfy. They refused to go to him, and he had them flogged. On another occasion, in 1760, Cope and his friend, Mr. Copige, turned up at a plantation called Egypt in Westmoreland, Jamaica. Mr. Cope wanted Cuba, and Mr. Copige wanted Little Mimba. Mimba did not want to go to him, and so Egypt Susanna was roughly taken to him instead. This was the same Susanna who had been whipped for refusing to go to Cope in 1756. It was after that that poor Susanna began to run away. Let us recall the women who opposed the gradualism of Wilberforce and his parliamentary colleagues, and from Brazil took the fight to the enslavers through participating in armed revolts. The 1692 Afro-Barbadian revolt, in which 51 were executed, 4 of them women. The 1736 revolt in Antigua, led by now national hero Court, alias Tacky, and his Creole co-conspirator Tomboy, in which his sister Filda and other enslaved women attended the plotting meetings, and Queen and Abba played a central role in the ceremonial preparations. Let us recognize the 1762 uprising of 36 male and female enslaved people in Berbice, and the 1763 Berbice War, at the end of which the Dutch executed, at a conservative estimate, 140 men and 4 women. We know it was more. Cecile Fatima was fundamental to the Haitian Revolution. Nanny Grigg played a prominent role in the 1816 war in Barbados. Mary Chisholm's shop in front of Success Plantation in Guyana, where the war started in 1823, harbored plotting enslaved Africans, even as she baked bread. In much the same way as Mary Ann Reed's party in Hanover, Jamaica, provided a cover for plotting the 1824 war in that island. In this same war in Demerara, at least one woman, Amber, from Plantation Enterprise, was seen carrying a musket on her shoulder, urging the enslaved people to kill a white man, asking, "You allow one Bukraman to knock down so many of you?" Sarah from Bonny Intention set fire on a heap of grass behind the slave quarters, maybe as a signal. Kate received 2 months in solitary confinement as her sentence after the war. and Susanna's role as informer to Jack was considered critical. Mary Ann Reid was the most important female figure implicated in 1824 in Jamaica. She used her house as a regular dance venue. For while overt political meetings of the enslaved were banned, dances were not. Mary Ann used her dances as political meetings to plan revolts. But as Beckles writes, while whites attended such dances, black and white clearly danced to the beat of different drums. Let us recall Mary Prince of Turks and Caicos, Bermuda and Antigua, whose narrative formed part of the anti-slavery discourse in the UK, for our ancestors used the pen, in some cases as effectively as the cutlass, the stone, and the gun. In the 1831 anti-slavery war in Jamaica that has come to be intimately associated with Samuel Sharp, women's roles have been recorded by contemporary writers, and I've already shown you some of these women. European writers themselves catalogue the punishments inhumanely meted out to the enslaved people for such activism. It is a familiar story of killings and wounding, decapitation with heads paraded on poles, sickening butchery, full prisons, deportation, flogging, and the offering of blood money to those who collaborated. In fact, as you know, about 1,000 guilders were paid to bring in 8 men apart from Pomina and Jack and the 10. Clearly then, no story of anti-slavery in the Caribbean can be told without the inclusion of women, and women's independent economic power and their contribution to the development of European industry must not be underestimated nor trivialized. Rather, we must emphasize their agency, for, as one of your important historians, the late Professor Elsa Gavaya, remarked all those years ago, and by the way, she was the first professor of history in the Department of History at Mona, and 40 years separated the two of us. You mentioned that I was the second, but she was the first, 40 odd years apart. And she said, there is much to be learned from the experiences of those who took part in these struggles for reform, who centered what ought to have been seen as universal tenets of liberty and equality, and raised the fundamental question then as to whether the rights of man, and I'm sure she meant women too, should be recognized and respected in the Caribbean. We stand on their shoulders today. And activism never stopped in the fight for rights, respect, and gender equity. In the post-slavery period, Caribbean women continued to struggle to eradicate and to dismantle political structures of imperialism, historical representations of the Caribbean in text and image that mostly reflected British colonial authority and subjectivity. They struggled to remove the iconic stamp of the colonizers, in the process reclaiming and reconstructing the indigenous African and Creole experience. This post-slavery struggle was critical because the passage of the Emancipation Act in 1833 and the eventual abolition of African enslavement did not end systems of domination. Consequently, women's activism in the cause of unambiguous freedom continued, with many joining the labor and decolonization movements of the late 19th and 20th centuries. It was in this period that we were introduced to women whose revolutionary ideology and program were clearly anchored in their experience and in their sense of what had become, as Rex Nettleford often terms it, a derided and emasculated ancestral culture. Black working class women made it clear that they had no intention of conforming to the Victorian gender order and the gender systems of the new era that sought to confine women to the private sphere of uncompensated labor in the home and promote the male as breadwinner ideology. In this regard, let us recall Antiguan Women of Freeman's Village, founded in 1842 as a home for the militant working class, who were famous for saying, "I am a free man woman." Let us recall Rosanna Finlayson, Caroline Grant, Sarah Johnson, and Elizabeth Taylor, who fought with Paul Bogle in the Morant Bay Rebellion, even though we would hardly know it based on the single story of that episode that we hear. So then Wilma tells us that Caroline Grant was referred to by a policeman at Morant Bay as a queen of the rebels, while Grant and Sarah Johnson ordered fleeing men to return to the scene of action. They rounded them up, in fact, and told them to go back and fight. Let us recall the women of Barbados who joined the 1876 Confederation riots, those in Belize who in 1886 stoned Governor Goldsworthy because of his poor decision to dredge canals in the hot season, an action which was considered conducive to the spread of yellow fever. Let us recall Belizean women, including Eve Jeffries, who in 1894 joined in protesting anti-labor actions of the timber merchants. Let us salute women who protested Crown Colony rule and lobbied for the franchise across the region. And we know that once they were given the right to representation, you have to excuse me, I'm suffering from the flu. Once they were given the right to representation in formal politics, whether at the parochial or central government levels, women seized the opportunity, like Elma Napier, who in 1940 became the first woman in the Caribbean to be elected to any parliament. And we know that women founded or co-founded trade unions and political parties and contested elections. Now, today, we laud the women who have shattered the glass ceiling, even partially, to become prime ministers or to head major political parties or establish women's arms of political parties like the Guyana Women's Political and Economic Organization, founded in 1946. And we know that Charles, Janet Jagan, Portia Simpson Miller, Kamala Prasad Visesa, and Mia Motley. And there are women who are lauded in the international arena, several of them Guyana born or with Guyanese parents. Rihanna, I wonder if you knew that. Deborah Cox, Dawn Lewis, and Baroness Amos. But let us be clear, their road was made easier because of the sacrifice of women who went before. They have benefited from the ground laid by the political activism of those who fought for emancipation. They have inherited a tradition of political activism because anti-slavery activism was deeply political. Eugenia Charles herself admitted that the coming into official leadership roles is not the commencement of Caribbean women taking the lead in politics and ensuring that the changes that became necessary from time to time took place. But because most of us employ a narrow definition of politics, equating it with representational politics, we often ignore these pioneering women whose politics took the form of resistance. For denied access to the corridors of power, the street became their political platform, their House of Representatives. That is why George Frederickson and Christopher Lash insisted that resistance is a political concept, and political activity, in the strictest sense of the word, is organized collective action which aims at affecting the distribution of power in a community. But while we have erected monuments to honor the men and the slavery and post-slavery and post-colonial heroes, where are the national monuments for women? I don't see the women. I know that there are plans to Janet Jagan and others, but I don't see them yet. And so I call on the ministries of culture and education across the region to correct this unforgivable act, especially as we approach another March 8th, an International Women's Day. We are called on to contribute to the building of a monument to enslaved people in New York. And a Guyanese woman, Cecile Nobrega, inspired the first public monument to a black woman in England. But we are not focusing on our own deficiencies in the area of symbolic decolonization. And one of the reasons there's no is that we don't know who the women are. We have not bothered to find out. I call on CARICOM to make history a mandatory subject in all secondary schools in the region, for the lack of awareness of these women icons that could empower our girls and women and give them strength in the face of the impact of socioeconomic tribulations is partly, not wholly, attributable to the lack of history education in our schools. The lack of awareness of women's contribution to Caribbean development also feeds hegemonic masculinity. Men finding in the education system support for their feeling that women's role in the Caribbean development was negligible. But most of the texts used to write history must also be revised. The recent review of history textbooks by the Institute for Gender and Development Studies reveals that women are underrepresented or left out altogether from accounts of economic and political development and discussions of power. Men's feeling of entitlement to that power also manifests itself in negative gender relations. Finally, it is also for these freedom-fighting women who insisted that such destabilization was vital to recover Black pride and dignity that we should intensify our call for reparation from all governments who participated in this transatlantic trade in Africans. Several have cried at the dungeons and doors of no return, have offered statements of regret and or apologies. For Anthony B., you don't have to say you're sorry when the damage is already done. For others, apology and regret without reparation equal hypocrisy and immorality. We who are gathered here this evening, as thinkers and activists who want to change Black people's condition in the world must keep their struggles for freedom in our consciousness and seek redress for the wrongs done to them. It is a just thing to do, as you would have heard from my colleague Professor Hilary Beckles, and injustice without a remedy is abhorrent to the spirit of justice. Yet reparation is a route to world peace and equal rights. One is linked to the other. The late Jamaican artist Peter Tosh already told us that there will be no peace without equal rights and justice. And Bob Marley, using the philosophy of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, long caution, and I end with this: until the philosophy, which holds one race superior and another inferior, is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war. Until there are no longer first-class and second-class citizens of any nation, until the color of a person's skin is of no more significance than the color of his or her eyes, until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regard to race, this is a war. That until that day, the dream of lasting peace, world citizenship, and rule of international morality will remain but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. I thank you.